333 BC. The most powerful empire on Earth has just made a catastrophic mistake. The Persian King Darius III has personally marched his enormous army behind Alexander the Great, cutting off every supply line, every retreat route, every connection back to Macedonia. Alexander wakes up one morning and discovers that the man he has been chasing across the known world is now behind him. His army is trapped between the Persian force and the Mediterranean Sea. His supply lines are cut. His retreat is blocked. Every military advisor in his camp is telling him the same thing. This situation is almost unwinnable. Alexander looks at the map, looks at his generals, and says something that defines exactly who he is. He says the lion does not worry about being surrounded by sheep. He turns his army around. And what happens next changes the ancient world forever. Before we get to the battle itself, we need to understand what was at stake at Issus. Because this was not simply another engagement in Alexander's campaign. This was the moment the entire war could have ended. Not with Alexander winning. With Alexander losing everything. He was 23 years old. He had been in Persian territory for less than 2 years. He had won at Granicus, but Granicus was against regional satraps, not the full Persian Empire. Now he was facing Darius III personally, the King of Kings commanding the full military resources of the wealthiest empire in the world. If Alexander lost at Issus, his army was destroyed, his campaign was over, and the Persian Empire continued as the dominant power of the ancient world. Everything depended on the next 24 hours. To understand Issus, you need to understand the strategic situation that produced it. After his victory at Granicus in 334 BC, Alexander had spent over a year methodically securing the western coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey. He liberated Greek cities from Persian control, besieged holdouts, and systematically removed Persian naval bases that could threaten his supply lines back to Macedonia. It was careful, unglamorous work that demonstrated a strategic patience that people who think of Alexander purely as a reckless cavalry charger consistently underestimate. By late 334 BC, Darius was taking the invasion seriously. The loss at Granicus had been embarrassing but manageable. It was regional forces, not the imperial army, that had fought and lost. Now Darius assembled something genuinely formidable. Ancient sources give numbers ranging from 250,000 to 600,000. Modern historians estimate more conservatively at between 100,000 and 150,000, but even the conservative estimate dwarfed Alexander's force of approximately 40,000. Darius's strategic genius, and it was genuine genius, whatever his later reputation suggests, was his decision to move his army behind Alexander rather than simply marching to meet him head-on. Alexander had been moving south along the coast toward Egypt. Darius came through the mountains of Anatolia and positioned himself at Issus north of Alexander's current position. He had placed himself directly across Alexander's supply and communication lines back to Macedonia. Alexander received the news and immediately understood two things simultaneously. First, that he was in serious danger. Second, that Darius had just made the battle happen on ground that neutralized the Persian numerical advantage. The narrow coastal plain at Issus would prevent Darius from using his numbers effectively. Understanding what each army brought to Issus is essential for understanding how the battle unfolded. Alexander's Macedonian army was the most sophisticated military force the ancient world had produced to that point. Its core was the Macedonian phalanx, infantry armed with the sarissa, a spear approximately 18 feet long that created an overlapping wall of spear points that was essentially impenetrable from the front when the formation was intact. Supporting the phalanx were the hypaspists, elite infantry who could operate with more flexibility than the rigid phalanx formation and who connected the phalanx to the cavalry on the right flank. The cavalry was Alexander's decisive weapon. The Companion Cavalry on the right flank were the finest heavy horsemen in the ancient world. Aristocratic Macedonians trained from childhood to ride and fight, armed with thrusting spears, disciplined and aggressive in a way that cavalry of this era rarely was. Alexander himself commanded the companions personally and always positioned himself on the right flank where he intended to deliver the decisive blow. The Persian army had genuine strengths of its own that are consistently underplayed in accounts that treat Issus purely as a Macedonian triumph. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius, professional soldiers trained in exactly the same traditions as Alexander's infantry, were formidable opponents for the Macedonian phalanx. The Persian cavalry was numerous and experienced. Darius had positioned his army intelligently given the terrain. The Pinarus River running across the battlefield gave his infantry a defensive line and his cavalry room to operate on the flanks, particularly the Persian left where the ground was wider. The two armies faced each other across the Pinarus River in November 333 BC. Ancient sources describe the moment before the battle began with the kind of detail that suggests eyewitness accounts fed into the historical record. The noise of the Persian army visible from the Macedonian lines, the music and ritual preparations on both sides, Alexander riding along his lines, speaking to unit commanders and soldiers personally, calling men by name, referencing their previous achievements in a way that ancient sources describe as having an almost electrical effect on morale. Alexander's battle plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. He would advance his right flank, where he personally commanded the Companion Cavalry, aggressively toward the Persian left. The phalanx in the center would advance across the Pinarus River and engage the Persian infantry, including the Greek mercenaries. The left flank under Parmenion would hold defensively against the Persian cavalry superiority on that side. The decisive blow would come from Alexander's cavalry on the right breaking through the Persian left and then turning inward toward the center, toward Darius himself. The advance began with Alexander moving faster than Darius expected. He was inside Persian arrow range quickly enough that the Persian archers had limited time to do significant damage before the Macedonian lines were too close for effective archery. The phalanx hit the Pinarus River and the fight for the crossing was brutal. The riverbank gave the defending Persian infantry and Greek mercenaries a genuine defensive advantage, and ancient sources describe serious fighting along this line, with the phalanx taking real casualties. Here is where the battle had its most dangerous moment for Alexander. A gap opened in the Macedonian line between the phalanx and the cavalry on the right. The two units advancing at different speeds across difficult terrain created a momentary separation in the formation. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius identified the gap and drove into it aggressively. For a period in the middle of the battle, the Macedonian center was in genuine trouble, being pushed back by professional infantry who knew exactly what they were doing and were executing it effectively. This was not a battle where everything went smoothly for Alexander. This was a battle where the outcome was genuinely uncertain for a significant period. On the right flank, Alexander was not waiting for the infantry battle to resolve itself. He had driven his companion cavalry forward with the aggressive speed that defined everything he did in battle. Not waiting to see how the situation developed, but creating the situation he wanted through sheer velocity and commitment. The Persian cavalry on their left flank was pushed back and then broken by the companion charge. And then Alexander did what he always did when he broke through. He turned inward. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Persian cavalry, which would have been the instinctive reaction and which would have taken the companions away from the main battle, Alexander wheeled his force left and drove directly toward the Persian center, toward the gap where the Greek mercenaries were fighting, toward the point in the line where Darius was positioned on his command chariot surrounded by his royal guard. The psychological effect of Alexander's companion cavalry appearing suddenly on their flank while they were engaged frontally with the phalanx was catastrophic for the Persian center. Units that had been fighting effectively began to dissolve. The Greek mercenaries who had been pushing the Macedonian phalanx back suddenly found themselves threatened from a direction they had not been watching. The carefully constructed Persian defensive line on the Pinarus River began to collapse from the right side inward. And then Darius made the decision that ancient sources describe as the turning point of the battle, and that we discussed in detail in our Darius video on this channel. He left the field. His chariot was surrounded by too much chaos and too much danger, and the rational calculation in that moment was that a dead Darius ended Persian resistance permanently, while a living Darius could rebuild and fight again. He transferred to a horse and rode east. The moment Darius was seen leaving the Persian formation, the collapse became general. Units that had been holding began breaking. The Persian cavalry on the left that had been pressing Parmenions' defensive line hard throughout the battle heard that the king was gone and began withdrawing. The battle was not over. Routing armies still killed people, and the pursuit after Issus produced significant additional casualties. But the outcome was no longer in question. Alexander had won. Again, the immediate aftermath of Issus produced one of the most famous and most revealing scenes of Alexander's entire campaign. Darius's camp at Issus contained his family, his mother Sisygambes, his wife Statira, his daughters, and his young son. They had accompanied the Persian army in the royal tradition of the Achaemenid court and were captured when Alexander's forces overran the camp during and after the battle. The Persian royal family believed Darius was dead and were in a state of profound grief and terror when Alexander's officers found them. Alexander's response to finding the family of the man he had just defeated on the battlefield tells you something essential about who he was, or at least who he understood himself to be and wanted history to remember him as. He went to them personally the following morning with his closest companion Hephaestion. Ancient sources describe Sisygambes, Darius's formidable elderly mother, initially prostrating herself before Hephaestion because he was taller and more physically imposing. When she was corrected, she was apparently mortified. Alexander reportedly said it did not matter. Hephaestion was also Alexander. He told them they had nothing to fear. He addressed Sisygambes with the full respect due to a queen and a grandmother, calling her mother in the Persian royal tradition. He told them Darius was alive and that their relationship with Darius was unchanged as far as their treatment was concerned. He provided them with their full royal household, their servants, their ceremonial meals, their privacy. They would be treated as the royal family they were rather than as prisoners or spoils of war. Whether this generosity was genuine personal feeling or sophisticated political calculation, probably both simultaneously, its effect was real and lasting. Sisygambes reportedly never wavered in her respect for Alexander from that moment forward. When Alexander died years later in Babylon, she refused to eat and died within days. Ancient sources say she simply chose to follow him. The woman whose son had been his greatest enemy chose to die with him rather than survive him. That is the measure of what happened in the tent after Issus. The military consequences of Issus were equally enormous. Darius still had his Eastern Empire. He still had resources and the ability to raise another army. But he had lost the western half of the Persian Empire effectively permanently. Alexander would spend the next year taking Phoenicia, Egypt, and the Levant, while Darius rebuilt in the east. The two men would meet once more at Gaugamela 2 years later. But Issus had already determined the psychological balance of that future encounter. Alexander had looked at Darius across a battlefield and won. Darius had looked at Alexander and left. Both men knew what that meant. The Battle of Issus was not the largest battle of Alexander's campaign. Gaugamela 2 years later involved bigger numbers and higher stakes in some respects. The sieges of Tyre and Gaza were longer and in some ways harder. But Issus was the battle that defined what Alexander's campaign actually was. Before Issus, it was possible to argue that Alexander was a talented young king raiding Persian territory. Dangerous but manageable, a problem that could be solved with sufficient force and better coordination of Persian resources. After Issus, that argument was gone. After Issus, it was clear that Alexander was something the ancient world had not seen before. A commander who could take an army 1/3 the size of his opponents, fight on ground chosen by that opponent, deal with genuine crisis in the middle of the battle when center was being pushed back, and still find the decisive moment and drive through it before anyone fully understood what was happening. The combination of strategic vision, operational flexibility, and personal tactical courage that Issus demonstrated was not something you could plan around. It was not something you could neutralize with numbers or terrain or preparation. Darius would spend 2 years trying to find a way to beat it. He would choose better ground at Gaugamela. He would have more men, more elephants, more scythed chariots. He would prepare more thoroughly than he had prepared for anything in his life. And Alexander would beat him again, because what Alexander had was not a better plan. It was a better mind. And at Issus, the ancient world saw that mind operating at full power for the first time. Nothing was ever quite the same after that afternoon on the Pinarus River.